About 6 weeks ago, I posted the video Dead on Arrival, my analysis of John Salsa and Robert Sisko's 700-page anti-sedevacantist tirade, True or False Pope. Despite its length, the video has gotten 5,300 views to date and has generated a lot of buzz on discussion boards and social media. Messrs. Salsa and Sisko, filled with zeal to defend the status of this man, Jorge Bergoglio, as a true and legitimate successor of St. Peter and the Vicar of Christ on earth, produced a two-part, 25,000-word response. This, mind you, just as the remnant put out a book called We Accuse Pope Francis, and after a group of mainline conservative Novus Ordo theologians put out a study censuring various propositions in Bergoglio's Amoris Laetitia as heretical, dangerous, contrary to Scripture, and scandalous. Messrs. Salsa and Sisko's time would have perhaps been better spent arranging a dignified burial for their argument, perhaps along the line of this video's title photos, with the fraternal help of some old friends. Be that as it may, we can't resist offering a short but frank eulogy of our own as part of the send-off. In the response, Messrs. Salsa and Sisko's first goal was to cover up the fact that they, 1, falsely attributed my argument for the vacancy of the Holy See to a pope's internal sin of heresy, and 2, did so because they could not get straight the basic distinctions that moral theologians laid down for the sin of heresy, thus rendering their whole argument dead on arrival. Their defense was to claim that, while they had indeed used the term internal heresy, and this over 70 times throughout the course of their book, they really, truly meant to use the correct term, occult heresy, which we would know by diligently comparing Chapter 3 of True or False Pope with Chapter 5 of True or False Pope. Right. We probably should have consulted Google Translate's Salsa-ese to moral theologianese function as well. Or maybe the Rosetta Stone. That might have helped us. The response had other unintentionally comic aspects as well. Messrs. Salsa and Sisko, of course, insist that Father Cekada absolutely cannot claim that the Vatican II popes have committed the public sin of heresy. But at the end of the same article, they have no hesitation whatsoever in saying that Father Cekada is a public heretic. Funny. No one gave me any warnings to establish my public pertinacity, which Messrs. Salsa and Sisko would require for the Vatican II popes, and the Church certainly didn't issue a judgment. Or were Messrs. Salsa and Sisko granted jurisdiction by their Holy Father to issue a public judgment? These mysteries we will leave aside. In the second part of the response, Messrs. Salsa and Sisko attempt to refute the sedevacantist argument that, due to public heresy, the Vatican II popes could not have been true popes in the first place. The sedevacantist argument here is based on canonists such as Wernz Vidal, Coronata, Badius, Cocci, and Sipos, who teach that as a matter of divine law, certain classes of people cannot be validly elected pope. These include the unbaptized, women, those under the age of reason, the habitually insane, and public schismatics and heretics. We've quoted these canonists in previous articles and videos, so we need not do so here again. In their latest article, Messrs. Salsa and Sisko do not even attempt to address the specific principles these canonists lay down. Rather, they try a more general end run around them by saying, well, the universal peaceful or pacific recognition by the whole Church of someone as Pope shows he meets all the requirements. Universal pacific recognition, they claim, establishes the papacy of a Vatican II Pope as a dogmatic fact, and it is therefore infallibly certain that the person chosen is the Pope. Sedevacantists are therefore schismatics, Father Cekada is guilty of mortal sin, etc., etc., etc. We've seen this argument and answered it before, as a check of my Salsa Cisco file from the previous film reveals. All right, there it is. They're recycling, which shows that they're at least obeying their Holy Father on something. First, Salsa and Cisco's argument on this point is, again, hypocritical and contradictory. Theologians classify dogmatic facts, together with the Church's universal disciplinary laws and canonizations, as secondary objects of infallibility. But on page 461 of their book, Messrs. Salsa and Cisco say of this general principle that, quote, the Church has never definitively taught this, much less clarified to what extent infallible protection would be guaranteed, unquote. So the infallibility of dogmatic facts is suddenly not really so ironclad after all. What's going on here? It's this. In chapters 15 and 16 of their book, Salsa and Cisco were trying to maneuver around the sedevacantist argument that the new Mass is a universal disciplinary law and is evil, which it could not have been if Paul VI had been a true pope. A true pope's universal disciplinary laws would have been protected as secondary objects of infallibility. So in their book, Messrs. Salsa and Cisco needed to say that the principle was never definitively taught. They also needed to do so because in chapter 17, they sought to dismiss as invalid certain post-Vatican II canonizations that SSPX rejects, those of the founder of Opus Dei, Escriva, and of John the 23rd and John Paul II. For Salsa and Cisco, then, secondary objects of infallibility are infallible for dogmatic facts, or are not infallible for universal disciplinary laws and canonizations, depending on which position works against sedevacantists and in favor of the SSPX party line. Second, to support their contention that a public heretic can be validly elected a true pope, thanks to universal peaceful recognition by the entire Church, Messrs. Salsa and Cisco quote large chunks from the writings of the Dominican theologian John of St. Thomas. But appealing to John of St. Thomas on universal peaceful recognition to validate the election of a heretic as pope is the one thing that Messrs. Salsa and Cisco cannot do. This is because a papal law in force at the time he was writing, Cum ex apostolatus officio of Paul IV, rendered such an election invalid, even with the unanimous consent of the cardinals and the obedience accorded the heretic pope by all. While traditionalists may dispute whether or not Cum ex apostolatus still applies now, there is no question that it was in force when John of St. Thomas was writing. So for the purpose of legitimizing a heretical pope, his comments on universal recognition must be treated as moot. So much for John of St. Thomas. Third, to further advance their contention that the Vatican II popes were true popes because of universal pacific recognition by the whole Church, Messrs. Salsa and Cisco quote the eminent 20th century theologian Louis Cardinal Billot. The adherents of the universal Church, says Billot, would be, always and by itself, an infallible sign of the legitimacy of the person of the pontiff. Otherwise, he explains, the gates of hell would prevail, and the promise of Christ to be with his church all days would not be fulfilled. Of course. But when you put Billot's reasons as to why this is so, beside the reality of how all traditionalists actually treated Paul VI and his successors, you not only defeat the Salsa-Cisco SSPX argument against sedevacantism, you also demonstrate that the whole lot of them are in reality sedevacantists themselves. This is so because Billot teaches that the whole Church must necessarily, 1. Adhere to a true pope as the living rule of faith, and 2. Obey him. As regards the first point, Billot explains, for it would be the same thing for the Church to adhere to a false pope, as it would be to adhere to a false rule of faith, since the pope is the living rule which the Church must follow in believing, and always, in fact, follows. Conversely, it follows that if the Church rejects a putative pope as the living rule of faith, it is likewise necessarily rejecting him as a true Roman pontiff, since his legitimacy and his status as the living rule of faith are two things which are essentially bound together. You can't have one without the other. Here, traditionalists of whatever stripe, from the beginning of the resistance to the changes in the 1960s, instinctively rejected the teachings of Vatican II and Paul VI as non-Catholic. In so doing, they ceased to regard Paul VI as the living rule of faith, and thus implicitly but necessarily rejected his status as a true pope as well. Traditionalists in those early days may not have had a unified or coherent explanation for how all this could have come about. Montini, I remember hearing, was a Marrano, a Mason, a Satanist, a communist infiltrator, the Antichrist, a modernist, a secret apostate, an anti-apostle, etc. But traditionalists agreed on at least one thing. They absolutely rejected Paul VI's teachings as non-Catholic. For them, Montini was in no way what Billot called the living rule which the Church must follow in believing, and always in fact follows. And in this respect, it was amusing to find Messrs. Salsa and Cisco attempting to shore up their case for universal recognition of Paul VI by quoting theologian Father Francis Connell's response to the following question in 1965. What certainty have we that the reigning pontiff is actually the primate of the universal Church? That is, that he became a member of the Church through valid baptism, and that he was validly elected pope? My reaction is, well, isn't it obvious from the mere fact that this question was asked in 1965, during the early days of Montini's putative reign, that some Catholics were challenging the validity of his election? Someone was worried enough to ask a question about it, and a prominent theologian thought it was important enough to answer in a theological journal. In any event, As the pernicious nature of the Vatican II changes became more widely recognized over the years, more and more Catholics came to reject Paul VI and his successors as the living rule of faith. When and how did the Society of St. Pius X and its founder, Archbishop Lefebvre, for instance, adhere to the teachings of the Vatican II popes as the living rule of faith to follow in believing? Was it when Archbishop Lefebvre said, "The current pope and bishops no longer hand down our Lord Jesus Christ, and that this new religion is not the Catholic religion"? Or was it when he said, "To whatever extent pope, bishops, priests, or faithful adhere to this new church, they separate themselves from the Catholic Church"? Or was it when he said, "For the moment they are in rupture with their predecessors. This is impossible. They are no longer in the Catholic Church"? Or when he said, "The conciliar church, having now reached everywhere, is spreading errors contrary to the Catholic faith. This false church is in an ever deeper state of rupture with the Catholic Church"? Or was it when his organization repudiated and mocked the catechism that John Paul II promulgated and had declared a statement of the Church's faith in Catholic doctrine and a sure norm for teaching the faith by openly referring to it as the Catechism? Or when Archbishop Lefebvre declared, "Rome has lost the faith, my dear friends. Rome is in apostasy." These are not words in the air. It is truth. Rome is in apostasy. They have left the church. This is sure, sure, sure. Are these the words of a man and an organization that recognize the legitimacy of Paul VI and his successors as the living rule which the church must follow in believing, and always in fact follows? And isn't this refusal the same arrangement Bishop Fillet seeks to perpetuate even now with Francis? To obtain his approval for SSPX as a personal prelature, while reserving the right to ignore and even to publicly criticize his doctrinal pronouncements? This brings us to the second sign of adherence that confirms a pope's legitimacy: obedience. On this point, Cardinal Biot treats the case of Pope Alexander VI, whom the Dominican friar Savonarola accused of heresy. Biot says the proof Alexander VI was not a false pope, but a legitimate one, is found in the fact that, quote, "all Christianity adhered to Alexander and obeyed him as a true pontiff." Which traditionalists in the R&R, Remnant, Catholic Family News, Salsa Cisco orbit ever truly did that? And especially, when did Archbishop Lefebvre and his society ever do that? When he repeatedly refused orders from Paul VI to close down his seminary and to cease ordinations? When he conferred episcopal consecrations in the face of threats from John Paul II? When he conducted a parallel apostolate throughout the world, as though the post-Vatican II popes did not exist? Archbishop Lefebvre's whole history, and that of his organization, is one of refusing to obey the post-conciliar popes as true pontiffs. Satan's masterstroke, he famously said, was to sow disobedience through obedience. In contrast, what weight or value should we assign to the recognition accorded the Vatican II popes by the vast majority of those who still called themselves Catholics, but in fact adhered to a new religion? To recognition, for instance, from the heretical modernist theologians who crafted the poisonous conciliar texts in order to subvert Catholic doctrine? Or from the modernist prelates who elected Roncalli and Montini, and at every turn approved, advanced, and implemented the revolutionary program of Vatican II? All these adhered to their fellow modernists, John the 23rd, Paul VI, and their successors, as the living rule of faith, which the Church must follow in believing, and obeyed them as true Roman pontiffs. Or what value should we assign to the recognition of the Vatican II popes by the 90% of lay Catholics who would accept and then advance the modernist revolution in doctrine, worship, and morals? But would the arch anti-modernist Cardinal Billot say we should regard recognition from creatures like these as the adherents of the universal church and as an infallible sign of legitimacy for such putative popes? Or would he in fact maintain the very opposite, that the adherence of the vast modernist horde to the conciliar popes and the rejection of their teachings and authority by faithful Catholics is proof of the conciliar popes' illegitimacy? In terms of both reasons that Billot gives for the Church's recognition of a pope as an infallible sign of legitimacy, therefore, the actions of faithful Catholics who repudiated and continued to repudiate the Vatican II religion are likewise a repudiation of the legitimacy of the Vatican II popes. Obviously, this is true of sedevacantists, but it is true of all traditionalists as well. For while the adepts of the recognize and resist position may indeed protest loud and long that they recognize the Vatican II popes as true and legitimate successors of Peter, their actions attest to the opposite, and indeed turn Billot's principle of universal peaceful recognition around on them. For their very rejection of the conciliar popes in practice as a living rule of faith and as the supreme authority to be obeyed is a damning judgment against the legitimacy of the conciliar pontificates. So SSPXers and R&R followers in reality are, and always have been, sedevacantists. It's just that they haven't admitted it yet.